You are standing at a crosswalk. The light is red, but a car rolls forward, a little too quickly. It stops just before the line, close to your legs. Your body tenses. For a second, something feels off. You glance at the driver. No eye contact. They are looking down, possibly at their phone. You hesitate, but eventually you step forward with the others. When the light turns green, your heart slows. You tell yourself they probably just misjudged the brake. You carry on with your day. At the office, a coworker begins arriving unusually late. They stop attending morning meetings. You notice their mood has changed, and their replies have become short, sometimes passive-aggressive. You sense something is wrong, but you stay quiet. You tell yourself they are probably just tired, maybe going through something. You avoid bringing it up. At home, the power flickers multiple times in one evening. You see the lights dim, then return to normal. Your phone buzzes, showing a message about a regional electrical overload. The news says the grid is under pressure, but there is no panic, so you return to scrolling. You charge your devices, you move on. Each of these moments seems ordinary. They do not appear dangerous or urgent. They are easy to dismiss. But these are exactly the kind of moments where a powerful psychological process begins to take hold. A process that convinces you to look away, to carry on, to normalize what is quietly abnormal. This is what psychologists refer to as normalcy bias. Normalcy bias is not just a failure to act. It is a built-in tendency to believe that the future will look very similar to the past. Even when there are clear signs that change is already happening, the brain does not easily accept disruption. It does not like uncertainty, so it leans toward explanations that preserve the illusion of stability. When something small feels off, you rarely treat it as serious. You soften it. You assume the pattern you know will return. This response is not unique to you. It is a deeply studied psychological effect. It is common, and in many cases, it is quietly harmful. People often miss the early signs of burnout, not because they are weak, but because the fatigue becomes part of the new normal. They tell themselves everyone is tired, everyone is under pressure. That feeling empty at work is just part of being a responsible adult. In relationships, the tone shifts over time. Respect fades in slow increments. Affection is replaced by routine. But instead of acknowledging the erosion, people rationalize it. They say things are just different now, that it is temporary, that relationships naturally become distant with time. When you begin to excuse patterns that make you feel uncomfortable, and when you repeatedly return to thoughts like it is probably nothing, or it will pass soon, what you are experiencing is not calmness. It is a psychological defense system. Normalcy bias allows your mind to delay discomfort. It helps you postpone decisions. It smooths over the edges of reality so that you do not have to confront change. And it often does this in small, quiet ways that are easy to ignore. What makes this bias especially dangerous is that it tends to grow stronger the longer it is left unchallenged. The more you explain things away, the more your mind adapts to dysfunction. Soon, even clear signs of trouble begin to blend into the background. You stop noticing them, or worse, you begin to view them as normal. In therapy, we see how long people endure situations that are clearly misaligned with their needs or values. They stay in workplaces where they are undermined. They ignore emotional withdrawal in close relationships. They keep dismissing physical symptoms that have lasted for months, not because they lack awareness, but because they have trained their minds to remain quiet. When we talk about dark psychology, we are not only referring to manipulation done by others. Sometimes the mind manipulates itself. It does so to maintain order, even if that order is artificial. Normalcy bias is one of the clearest examples of this internal deception. It gives you comfort at the cost of clarity. It tells you that silence means safety, that no reaction means no problem, that if no one else is worried, you should not be either. But emotional safety is not the same as actual safety. Calmness does not guarantee that nothing is wrong, and pretending things are fine does not make them so. Sometimes the most dangerous lies are the ones you quietly repeat to yourself to keep from looking too closely. In nearly every environment where people grow, live, and make sense of the world, there is an underlying belief that safety is the default state of life. It is never taught directly, but it is implied in almost everything around us. From childhood, most of us are raised with routines designed to create stability. We attend school according to schedules. We come home to predictable patterns. We are taught to trust adults, follow instructions, and assume that if something is truly wrong, someone will intervene. This early conditioning sets a powerful foundation. It trains the brain to expect order. Over time, it becomes natural to believe that events outside of that structure are rare, and that if something truly dangerous were to happen, it would come with a warning, a sign, or a signal from someone with authority. That belief does not disappear in adulthood. It evolves. We trust that professionals know what they are doing, that institutions are stable, that infrastructure will hold, that warning systems will activate if needed. This trust is not irrational, but when it becomes automatic and unquestioned, it opens the door to a form of mental blindness. The assumption that the world is safe and manageable under most conditions is in many ways a false comfort. It is a belief that allows people to carry on with their daily lives without being overwhelmed by anxiety. But it is also a belief that can prevent awareness, delay action, and suppress instinct. In the field of psychology, we often examine how belief systems shape perception. What you believe influences what you notice. If you fundamentally believe that your surroundings are safe, your brain will unconsciously filter out signs that contradict that belief, not because you are choosing to ignore danger, but because the signal does not fit your internal model of the world. This is the subtle mechanism that supports normalcy bias. When someone receives news that their company is downsizing, they may hear the words, but their mind still holds the image of a stable job. When a person sees subtle changes in a partner's behavior, they may notice those changes, but immediately explain them away. The mind protects its model of reality, even when reality has shifted. This belief in ongoing safety is not just emotional, it is also neurological. The human brain is wired to conserve energy. It prefers to operate under familiar patterns. Threat detection requires mental effort. Risk assessment uses cognitive resources, and unless the signal is loud, direct, and unavoidable, the brain will often choose to interpret it as non-threatening. In many therapeutic settings, individuals describe moments when they sensed that something was wrong, but felt no urgency to act. They did not feel fear. They felt confusion, or a sense of waiting. That space between recognizing that something might be wrong and actually accepting that something is wrong is where normalcy bias quietly takes over. The belief that the world is mostly safe leads people to postpone difficult decisions. They delay ending relationships that have turned harmful. They avoid confronting a colleague who is clearly overstepping boundaries. They ignore persistent pain in their body, assuming it will resolve itself with rest. These are not dramatic moments. They are quiet, internal, repetitive, and because they are so common, they often go unnoticed. From a psychological standpoint, it is important to understand that belief does not require evidence. It only requires repetition. If you grow up seeing safety, hearing reassurances, and experiencing stability, your brain begins to code those conditions as permanent. But safety is not permanent. It is conditional. It requires attention. It can erode quietly. That is the dark truth at the core of this discussion. The world is not always safe. People are not always predictable. Systems do fail, and when they do, there is often no immediate announcement. No one stops the routine to explain that the pattern is breaking, that responsibility falls on the individual, on you, on me, on anyone who wants to see clearly before it becomes too late. This is why the belief in constant safety is not just misleading. It is dangerous. It keeps people in places they should leave. It makes silence feel like evidence. It creates a false sense of calm that becomes harder to break the longer it is maintained. When we allow that belief to go unchallenged, we begin to design our lives around assumptions rather than facts. We ignore early signs. We wait for confirmation, and we tell ourselves that if no one else is reacting, then we are overthinking it. But perception is not the same as reality. The absence of alarm is not proof that everything is fine. It may only be proof that everyone else believes the same lie. There is a pattern in human behavior that repeats itself across cultures, generations, and environments. People notice something strange. They feel discomfort. A quiet alarm goes off in the back of their mind. But instead of acting, they wait. They tell themselves it is probably nothing. They focus on something else. They continue with their routine. This moment where thought does not become action is central to how the mind handles discomfort. In psychology, this process is not accidental. It is structured, and it often begins with a mechanism known as normalcy bias. When the brain encounters information that contradicts its current understanding of the world, it has a choice to make. It can either update its model of reality, or it can protect the one that already exists. The second option is easier, less costly, less disruptive, and so, more often than not, that is the path it takes. Normalcy bias is a defense mechanism. It reduces psychological friction by ignoring or reshaping anything that feels threatening to mental stability. The mind does not enjoy disruption. It does not welcome uncertainty. So it adjusts perception to make things feel normal again. You see this process at work in many common situations. A person hears their partner make a subtle insult in public, but they smile and laugh it off. It is easier to do that than to confront what the words might actually mean. Another notices their bank balance dropping faster than expected, but delays looking deeper into the statements. The numbers are correct. The anxiety is real. But the mind leans toward the idea that things will even out soon. It avoids the tension. This avoidance is not a sign of weakness. It is an indication of how the brain prioritizes emotional regulation over logical accuracy. When faced with discomfort, the brain does not immediately try to solve the problem. It first tries to reduce the emotional disturbance caused by the problem. That is why normalcy bias is closely related to denial. But unlike denial, which is often conscious, normalcy bias operates quietly. You may not even be aware it is happening. It does not say this is false. It says this is fine, and that distinction is critical. From a behavioral psychology perspective, normalcy bias is considered a form of mental inertia. Once a person develops a stable pattern of behavior and belief, they resist breaking that pattern unless the signal for change is extremely strong. Subtle cues are often dismissed. Early signs are treated as outliers. This tendency is stronger in environments where predictability is valued and disruption is penalized. In a controlled study on decision-making under uncertainty, researchers observed that participants consistently underestimated the likelihood of negative events, even when presented with factual data. They preferred explanations that allowed them to maintain their routine. Even when prompted to reassess, many adjusted only slightly, just enough to say they considered the facts, but not enough to significantly alter their behavior. This reveals something important. The brain is not built to respond to the truth. It is built to maintain balance. If a new piece of information threatens that balance, the brain will try to reinterpret it until it no longer feels like a threat. That reinterpretation can take many forms. It can sound like it is probably nothing, or they are just having a bad day, or it will pass. These thoughts are not based on analysis. They are based on the desire to return to comfort. Normalcy bias is not always irrational. In some cases, it protects against overreaction. But the cost of overusing this bias is that real problems grow silently. They gain time, they gain space, and eventually they gain control. As this mental pattern deepens, it begins to shape more than just immediate reactions. It influences long-term choices, relationships, and even a person's sense of self. If you regularly override discomfort in favor of normality, you begin to internalize the habit of looking away. You become skilled at rationalizing situations that do not feel right. You find words to explain them. You tell yourself stories that keep you from seeing the full picture. In therapeutic practice, This process often becomes visible through repetition. Clients describe the same uncomfortable dynamic at work for months or even years, but continue to call it temporary. Others describe emotionally painful relationships where criticism or withdrawal has become frequent, yet still describe the connection as stable. It is not that they cannot see the truth. It is that their perception has been gradually reshaped by normalcy bias. This reshaping is not passive. It requires cognitive work. The mind suppresses certain thoughts, emphasizes others, and maintains a sense of balance through selective focus. If the body feels stress but the conscious mind says everything is fine, the disconnection between those two systems builds tension. That tension does not disappear. It moves into the body, into behavior, into sleep, and into emotional fatigue. Over time, the person may become tired without understanding why. They may feel anxious without a clear reason. They may lose motivation, struggle with concentration, or feel distant from their own emotions. These are common signs that the mind is carrying unresolved contradiction. The outer narrative is calm, but the internal system knows something is wrong. Normalcy bias, when left unexamined, becomes a psychological filter. It is not only about what you ignore, it is about what you fail to notice altogether. You stop scanning for subtle changes. You stop trusting intuition. You build your decisions on assumptions that were never tested, and the longer this continues, the harder it becomes to see the difference between adaptation and denial. This is why dark psychology treats normalcy bias as more than just a cognitive error. It is considered a psychological vulnerability, something that can be exploited, not only by others but by your own unexamined beliefs. When people want to believe that something is fine, they can become easy to mislead, not because they are unaware, but because they are invested in the idea that everything is under control. This bias is not only present in personal matters, it appears in society, in systems, and in leadership. A problem may be visible, measurable, and widely acknowledged in private, but public behavior remains unchanged. Meetings continue, plans proceed, smiles are maintained, not because no one sees the problem, but because acknowledging it would mean accepting that the situation is no longer normal, and that acceptance comes with responsibility. Normalcy bias is easier to maintain than disruption. It is less painful than change, and for many people, it becomes a way of life. They stop seeking clarity. They stop asking difficult questions. They settle into a version of normal that is no longer safe, no longer functional, but still familiar. Eventually, the habit of pretending becomes part of identity. You start to believe that staying calm, staying passive, staying neutral is maturity. You confuse silence with wisdom, and you tell yourself that people who act, who confront, who challenge the pattern are simply overreacting. This is the long-term cost of normalcy bias. It takes away urgency, it dulls perception, and it quietly convinces people to accept far less than they need, far less than they deserve, and far less than what is real. Pretending becomes easier than seeing, but what is easy for the mind often becomes dangerous for the life it tries to protect. There is a point at which perception no longer matches reality, but the person experiencing it does not notice, not because they are unaware, but because their mind has already edited what is allowed to be seen. This process is subtle. It does not require hallucinations or delusions. It simply requires the human brain doing what it often does best: filtering. Psychologically, the brain does not process every detail of the world around it. Instead, it selects. It focuses on what confirms existing beliefs. It blurs or discards what creates tension. This filtering process is a core function of cognition. Without it, reality would be overwhelming. But when the filters become too narrow, they no longer protect the mind. They begin to deceive it. This is where cognitive dissonance enters the picture. When a person holds two opposing beliefs or experiences that contradict each other, the discomfort becomes difficult to tolerate. For example, someone might believe they are in a healthy relationship, but regularly feel unimportant or neglected. That gap between belief and feeling creates internal pressure. To relieve the discomfort, the mind has two options. It can reevaluate the relationship, or it can distort the perception. Most often, the mind chooses distortion. It lowers the emotional volume of the pain. It exaggerates small moments of affection. It focuses on neutral behavior instead of harmful patterns. This allows the belief to remain intact. The cost, however, is truth. This defense mechanism is not rare. It is common. It appears in personal life, professional environments, and even in political or cultural identity. People continue working under toxic leadership by telling themselves that no job is perfect. They justify unethical decisions with rational-sounding arguments. They defend harmful routines by pointing to past moments of success. The brain resists rewriting its identity. If a person has believed something for years, and that belief begins to crack, the psychological discomfort can feel like a threat to the self. So the filters tighten, the story adjusts, the mind begins to block what it does not want to accept. In sessions with patients, this dynamic often becomes visible when someone describes feeling confused about how to respond to a problem they have described many times. They say the same sentences. They know something is wrong, but they feel frozen. That freeze response is not just about fear. It is about the brain choosing to pause instead of confront. It waits for reality to return to the previous pattern, even if that pattern is already gone. This freeze response is not laziness. It is not weakness. It is the product of a mental system that values stability more than clarity. When the brain blocks out uncomfortable truths, it is not trying to harm the individual. It is trying to protect them from fear, from guilt, from shame, and from the emotional cost of facing what cannot be unseen once it is acknowledged. However, that protection can quickly turn into paralysis. A person begins to live in a version of reality that feels safe, but is no longer accurate. They ignore messages from their own body, loss of sleep, sudden fatigue, recurring illness, because acknowledging those signs would require accepting that something in their life needs to change. And change always carries risk. The longer a person remains in this suspended state, the more they lose access to instinct. This is not metaphorical. The brain's threat response system, including structures like the amygdala and hippocampus, becomes desensitized when stress signals are consistently overridden. The result is a muted internal alarm. Danger no longer feels urgent. It feels vague, soft, easy to dismiss. In real-world situations, this leads to decisions that appear irrational from the outside. A person stays in an unsafe home. They continue trusting someone who has clearly violated boundaries. They defend a belief even when presented with contradictory facts. They know, but they do not act. And the more they normalize that gap between knowledge and behavior, the harder it becomes to reconnect the two. In behavioral terms, this is called suppression. But in dark psychology, this pattern is viewed as a point of entry, something that can be exploited. When individuals stop trusting their own senses, they become dependent on external cues. They begin to look outward for permission to feel alarm. They wait for others to react before they allow themselves to accept what they already suspect. This is why collective silence is so powerful. If no one speaks up, if no one breaks the illusion, the mind interprets the absence of panic as evidence that everything is fine. Even in a room full of discomfort, people may stay quiet, not because they are convinced, but because no one else is moving. This is not just a failure to process information. It is the brain's deep loyalty to whatever has kept it emotionally safe up until that point. And when safety is tied to routine, even dangerous situations can begin to feel familiar, predictable, almost comforting. That is how denial becomes invisible. It is no longer an active choice. It becomes a passive state, something lived in, rather than questioned. And once a person begins to live in denial, they stop updating their understanding of reality. At that stage, change does not feel difficult. It feels impossible. And when the mind can no longer tell the difference between what is real and what is familiar, it will always choose what is familiar, even if it leads directly into harm. Human beings are not just afraid of pain or danger. They are deeply afraid of disorder, of unpredictability, of the feeling that things are happening without pattern, logic, or reason. This fear is more than emotional discomfort. It is a psychological threat to the very structure the mind depends on to function. At the core of daily life, there is a quiet agreement you make with the world, that your surroundings will remain relatively stable, that people will behave in ways you expect, that the structures you rely on, social, financial, physical, will continue to hold. This agreement is rarely spoken, but it is built into the habits, schedules, and routines of modern living. When something violates that agreement, it shakes more than just your plans. It disturbs the foundation of perceived control. The mind reacts not only to the external change, but to the internal fear that the world is more chaotic than previously believed. This realization is not welcome, it is unsettling, and for many it feels intolerable. To avoid this discomfort, the brain creates what psychologists refer to as the illusion of control. This illusion is not a fantasy in the usual sense. It is a cognitive distortion that allows you to feel agency where little or none actually exists. You may check the door twice before leaving, believing this small ritual secures your home. You may create detailed plans for a week ahead, thinking that planning guarantees stability. You may follow familiar routines after receiving difficult news as a way to feel grounded. These behaviors are not wrong. They are often helpful, but when they become rigid or compulsive, they begin to act as a buffer between you and the truth that control is partial, temporary, and easily broken. This is where normalcy bias draws its strength. The fear of chaos is so deeply embedded in the psychological system that when disorder begins to creep in, the brain does not simply analyze it, it resists it. It pushes back, it tells stories, it reshapes perception to maintain the illusion. And because this reaction happens beneath awareness, it feels natural. You may not tell yourself everything is under control, but you behave as if it is. You go to work, you reply to messages, you perform routines, even when a loved one has stopped speaking to you, even when bills remain unpaid, even when you know, on some level, that something is cracking underneath. This illusion of control does not only live in individual behavior, it is reinforced by culture. Societies encourage order, schools reward predictability, workplaces are built around metrics, rules, and procedures. From early life, people are trained to manage the unexpected, not by facing it directly, but by organizing it into systems. But when something cannot be systematized, when an experience does not fit into the existing model, the brain experiences friction, a growing sense that the world is slipping out of its grasp. And rather than adjust, the mind often retreats. It doubles down on routine, it clings to control, it begins to pretend. This form of psychological rigidity is particularly dangerous when combined with fear. If a person believes that acknowledging chaos will lead to collapse, they will protect the illusion at any cost. They will silence concerns. They will avoid conversations. They will edit their memories. They will rewrite their present, just to keep the system intact. In existential psychology, this is referred to as terror management. The human mind, when faced with the unpredictable nature of existence, constructs defenses against the idea that life is fragile, that everything you rely on, relationships, health, systems, beliefs, can change without notice, without preparation, without fairness. This truth is difficult to carry, so the mind reduces its exposure to it. One of the most effective ways to do that is to convince itself that control still exists, that patterns still hold, that things are not as bad as they appear. Normalcy bias becomes the tool that allows this to happen. It protects the illusion by minimizing the signs of collapse. It turns unfamiliar signals into background noise. It pushes your focus toward what still works, what still looks normal. It tells you that if you keep moving, keep doing what you always do, then everything will return to balance. But the balance is already gone. In psychological research, people who experience a sudden loss of control, whether through job loss, illness, betrayal, or sudden change, often described the experience not only as painful, but disorienting. The pain can be named, but the disorientation lingers. It comes from realizing that the story of control was never as strong as it once felt. And yet, even after that realization, many return to the same habits, the same beliefs, the same explanations, because chaos, once seen, is hard to unsee, and the brain prefers comfort to clarity. This is why so many people remain in predictable suffering. They would rather feel in control of a painful situation than admit they are powerless in an unpredictable one. They would rather tell themselves that what they are experiencing is normal than accept that the ground beneath them has already shifted. The illusion of control is not harmless. It may protect the mind from fear, but it leaves the rest of life exposed to damage the mind refuses to see. There is a point in nearly every unfolding problem where the signs are already present, but the action never arrives. It is not that people are unaware. In most cases, they are already noticing what is changing. The discomfort has already begun. The data is already there, but still nothing is done. A woman wakes up each morning and feels slightly more disconnected than the day before. She sits in her car for longer before entering the office. She used to laugh at lunch with her co-workers, but now she scrolls through her phone in silence. At night, her sleep is shallow. The thoughts do not stop. Her appetite shifts. Her motivation fades. But she still shows up. She still completes her tasks. She still tells herself, this is just a stressful month. Maybe it is the weather. Maybe it is just burnout. Weeks pass, then months. The signs accumulate, but action does not follow. When she eventually reaches out for help, her language is filled with uncertainty. She says she did not realize how far it had gone. She says it crept up slowly, that she never thought it would feel this heavy. And yet, when her story is told in full, it becomes clear. She saw it coming, she just did not move. This phenomenon is one of the most misunderstood aspects of human behavior. People often ask, why do individuals stay in harmful situations? Why do they wait until the damage is deep before reacting? The assumption is often that they were unaware, but awareness is not the issue. The deeper problem is inhibition, a mental freezing that prevents response, and that freezing is often driven by normalcy bias. The bias convinces the mind that what is happening is temporary, that the pattern will correct itself, that discomfort is a phase, not a signal. So instead of preparing for disruption, the person doubles down on routine. They continue as if nothing is changing, even when everything inside them says otherwise. The same principle appears in financial stress. A person sees the bills accumulating. They feel the weight of debt growing. They start using one credit card to pay off another. They avoid checking account balances. They stop opening bank emails. In their mind, they are managing the situation. In reality, they are postponing the inevitable, not because they cannot do the math, but because they are mentally postponing the acceptance that something has gone out of control. This is what makes normalcy bias so quietly destructive. It does not block the warning signs. It reinterprets them. It whispers that a correction is just around the corner, that no drastic action is needed yet, that it will all settle if you just keep going like before. And this is where most people get stuck. Not in confusion, but in hope. Not the kind of hope that leads to preparation and planning, but the passive kind. The hope that delays. The hope that asks you to wait one more week, to check again next month, to hold off on the conversation until the timing feels better. This mental delay becomes a habit. People learn to suppress their instincts. They stop listening to their internal signals. Instead, they outsource their decision-making to the absence of crisis. If nothing explodes, they assume nothing is wrong. But psychology tells us that by the time an emotional, physical, or social collapse becomes visible, the internal systems have often been degrading for much longer. Action delayed becomes action denied. This delay between recognition and response is not only a personal behavior pattern, it is also a collective one. People in groups tend to wait for social confirmation before responding to a threat. In psychology, this is referred to as pluralistic ignorance, which is the tendency to assume that if no one else is reacting, then the situation may not be as serious as it seems. Each person privately senses that something is wrong, but because no one openly responds, the discomfort remains unspoken. The result is collective inaction, even in the presence of obvious warning signs. Imagine a classroom where a faint smell of smoke enters from the hallway. A few students notice it. One glances toward the door. Another looks up at the ceiling lights. But no one says a word. Everyone watches each other, waiting for a cue. If no alarm sounds, if the teacher remains calm, then the class returns to silence. That silence becomes the signal to stay still. This kind of behavior is not limited to emergencies. It is deeply embedded in social environments. It appears in the culture of workplaces, families, and entire communities. People witness inappropriate comments, repeated boundary violations, or unhealthy patterns, but choose to look away. They rationalize their silence. They say it is not their responsibility, or that it is better not to get involved. Over time, this habit of inaction allows dysfunction to thrive unnoticed. In many clinical conversations, patients describe extended periods of emotional suffering that they knew were not sustainable. They speak of moments when they noticed clear changes in themselves. Some lost interest in everything they once enjoyed. Others became emotionally numb or increasingly agitated. And yet, they waited, not because they lacked awareness, but because they believed it would resolve on its own. They hoped the next day would be better. They waited for some kind of emotional reset that never came. This internal delay is what makes normalcy bias so difficult to recognize in real time. It does not block the warning signs, it reshapes them. It softens the urgency. It introduces just enough hope to justify one more week of doing nothing, one more day of silence, one more round of avoidance. In social systems, this dynamic has far-reaching effects. It allows harmful structures to remain intact for years. When signs of deterioration appear in public services, institutions, or leadership, the population often senses the problem early. People discuss it privately. They notice the inefficiencies. They feel the frustration. But public behavior remains largely unchanged. The reason is not confusion. It is the lingering belief that the system will eventually self-correct. This gap between what people see and what they do is one of the most dangerous blind spots in collective psychology. It allows patterns to continue long after they have become harmful. Individuals begin to normalize things they once found unacceptable. They lower expectations, they adjust definitions of what is tolerable, and they convince themselves that the situation is not urgent. In these conditions, it becomes easier to rely on fragments of hope than to commit to meaningful change. One polite moment is used to excuse months of passive aggression. One good week is enough to delay the conversation about a toxic relationship. One temporary improvement justifies restarting the cycle of inaction. This is why dark psychology recognizes normalcy bias as a strategic weakness in the human mind. It provides a silent window of time in which problems are able to grow stronger without resistance. It creates space for avoidance. It offers relief without resolution. And over time, it replaces urgency with repetition. By the time most people finally respond, the damage is no longer subtle. It has reached their relationships. It has affected their health. It has changed the way they think, feel, and behave. Their responses are no longer proactive. They are reactive, and reactive responses often come with fewer options and higher costs. You do not need chaos to confirm that something is wrong. But if you keep waiting for a collapse, you may realize too late that you have been living inside one all along. Calm is often praised as a strength. People are told to remain composed under pressure, to stay steady when others panic, and to control their emotions in difficult situations. In many ways, calmness is associated with maturity and intelligence. It creates an image of someone who is rational, someone who does not overreact. someone who can be trusted when things go wrong. But there are moments when calmness is not a strength. There are moments when it becomes a form of paralysis, when it stops being a response to uncertainty and becomes a way to ignore it. In those moments, calmness is no longer a stabilizing force. It becomes a psychological defense, a mask, a barrier that prevents recognition of what is truly happening. This kind of calm is not neutral. It is not peace. It is the result of the mind overriding emotional signals to maintain a sense of control. And when this behavior continues unchecked, it leads to serious consequences. Calmness, when misplaced, can become fatal. In psychological practice, we often hear stories from people who sensed danger long before it unfolded. They say they noticed the signs, felt the shift, sensed the distance, but they told themselves to stay calm. They tried not to make assumptions. They waited. They hoped. They minimized their concerns, thinking that staying calm would make things better. But it did not. The human brain is wired to reduce discomfort. One way it does this is by suppressing signals that create tension. You may feel stress in your chest, but if you mentally tell yourself everything is fine, that stress may not be processed as urgency. Instead, the emotion is buried under logic. You reason your way out of fear. You analyze your way out of action. And this is exactly where normalcy bias does its most silent work. It tells you that reacting would be impulsive, that waiting is safer, that calmness is wisdom. But what you are experiencing is not clarity. It is a form of emotional sedation. The discomfort is still there. The situation is still deteriorating. But because you appear calm, and because others appear calm, your brain delays further response. This delay can be dangerous. In medical settings, for example, patients sometimes wait too long to report symptoms. They convince themselves the pain is manageable. They tell themselves not to overreact. By the time they seek treatment, the condition has advanced beyond early intervention. In relationships, a partner may stop showing affection, may stop listening, may begin pulling away emotionally, but the other person stays calm. They keep routines in place. They avoid confrontation. They interpret the lack of open conflict as a sign that everything is still stable, and slowly the connection fades. Not because of one dramatic event, but because of the quiet tolerance of emotional neglect. When emotional suppression becomes habitual, the mind begins to ignore its own warning system. You might feel unease in a conversation, but brush it off. You might sense that someone is withholding something, but convince yourself it is just your imagination. Over time, your ability to detect subtle shifts becomes weaker, not because the signs are no longer there, but because you have trained your mind to stay still in the presence of discomfort. This is where calmness becomes a liability. In situations where urgency is required, where a decision needs to be made, or where boundaries need to be asserted, the habit of appearing composed becomes a trap. You hesitate, you smile through pain, you keep conversations polite when truth is needed, and in doing so, you allow conditions to continue that are slowly working against your well-being. In psychological terms, this behavior is linked to emotional inhibition. It is the repeated act of suppressing valid emotional responses in order to preserve social harmony or internal comfort. While it may seem functional in the short term, it comes with significant long-term costs. Repressed emotions do not disappear. They shift forms. They surface in anxiety, fatigue, irritability, and eventually in disengagement. Many individuals who appear calm on the outside are carrying high levels of internal distress. They have learned to maintain composure because they believe showing concern would be inappropriate or disruptive. But their silence is not a sign of peace. It is a coping mechanism. In darker psychological contexts, this calmness becomes useful to those who wish to manipulate, exploit, or control. If someone can keep you calm while undermining your trust, crossing your boundaries, or slowly eroding your confidence, they will do so without resistance. They count on your stillness, they count on your politeness, and they know that as long as you remain composed, they can continue unnoticed. This is why dark psychology does not always rely on fear to gain power. It often relies on quiet, on the emotional freeze, that comes from normalcy bias, on the internal voice that says stay calm, it is not serious yet, do not speak, do not act. That voice becomes stronger each time it is obeyed, and eventually, it becomes part of identity. You begin to see yourself as someone who does not panic, someone who handles things quietly, someone who avoids unnecessary drama. But in reality, what you are avoiding is the truth. Inaction, dressed in the costume of emotional maturity, becomes your default. You wait, you accommodate, you stay calm in situations that are clearly harmful. And the longer this continues, the more damage is done. What began as a desire to maintain peace ends in the loss of clarity, the erosion of self-respect, and often the quiet collapse of things that could have been saved if only someone had acted when it first started to feel wrong. Calmness is not always a virtue. Sometimes it is the final mask, worn before everything falls apart. In every functioning society, power depends not only on laws, institutions, or wealth. It depends on something more fragile and less visible. It depends on people not noticing when the rules are quietly changing. The most effective forms of control do not begin with force. They begin with patterns, with familiarity, with a sense that things will go on as they always have. People feel safest when life follows a familiar rhythm, when days look similar, when systems feel stable, and when authority presents itself with confident structure. This illusion of stability creates trust. That trust, over time, becomes habit, and that habit is what makes it possible for influence to grow unnoticed. The human mind resists sudden change. It prefers predictability, so when change arrives in small pieces, when control tightens gradually, when freedom is limited just a little at a time, most people do not respond immediately. They hesitate, they wait, they look to others for cues, and when no one reacts, they convince themselves that everything is still within bounds. This tendency is not random. It has been observed repeatedly in psychological research, especially in studies focused on authority, compliance, and conformity. The reason people stay silent in the presence of mild injustice is not because they approve of it. It is because they are unsure whether it requires a reaction. That hesitation is enough to stop momentum. It is enough to protect the status quo. This is where normalcy bias becomes a powerful tool for those in control. When small restrictions are introduced, or when a narrative shifts slightly to justify a new policy, the average person does not feel alarmed. They feel uncertain. That uncertainty is smoothed over by the assumption that someone else would speak up if the situation were serious. They return to their day. They continue with routine. The discomfort becomes a background thought. Those who hold power know this. They know that people will adapt to nearly anything, so long as it happens slowly. They know that a dramatic change will cause resistance, but a quiet shift will be absorbed. One rule becomes two. One exception becomes standard. One surveillance measure becomes a safety requirement. And all of it happens while the population is still thinking it over. This process is not theoretical. It has occurred across history, in various nations, under different ideologies. What remains consistent is the method, a gradual erosion of boundaries, a reshaping of definitions, a soft redirection of public focus. The key to making it all work lies in psychological timing. If the population is still processing the last change, they are not ready to push back against the next one. People continue to trust the system, even when their daily lives begin to contradict it. They believe that temporary discomfort is a sign of adjustment, not a warning. They convince themselves that questioning authority would be irrational, or that they do not have enough information to make a judgment, and so they wait, not realizing that the moment for questioning is already behind them. This is the mental trap of normalcy bias. It does not tell you that nothing is wrong. It tells you that nothing is wrong enough. And that slight difference is what keeps people silent, while power becomes more concentrated. Once power understands that people tend to adjust rather than resist, the strategy becomes predictable. Instead of overwhelming the public with large shifts, power introduces change through carefully measured steps, one rule at a time, one modification to language, one adjustment in expectation. Each step is framed with justification, softened by careful words, and surrounded by silence. The silence of others becomes the most powerful tool of reinforcement. In this silence, people begin to wonder whether their discomfort is valid. If the policy truly mattered, someone else would say something. If the change were truly unfair, it would be discussed openly. But when nothing happens, when daily life continues, people choose to believe the discomfort is theirs alone. That belief becomes internalized. And once internalized, it is no longer questioned. This is how normalcy bias becomes more than a passive habit. It turns into a framework for understanding the world. Each time the mind chooses to normalize something slightly uncomfortable, it becomes more skilled at doing so. The next time. Over time, individuals no longer notice that their standards have shifted. They begin to interpret silence as peace. They begin to confuse adjustment with agreement. In psychological studies, especially those exploring compliance and social influence, the results are consistent. When individuals are placed in environments where a group accepts something questionable or illogical, most people follow the group, not because they do not notice the problem, but because the social cost of speaking out appears higher than the personal cost of staying quiet. Power systems rely on this. They use group silence as a substitute for consent. When no one resists, it appears as if everyone agrees. And in a world where appearance often outweighs truth, that illusion is enough to move forward. This effect is magnified by modern life. In large populations, individual voices can feel small. People begin to believe that speaking up will not matter, that their objection will be lost in the noise. So they keep quiet, not because they are convinced, but because they feel isolated. In truth, many others feel the same way, but because no one breaks the surface, each person continues believing that they are the only one who sees it. This creates an invisible network of shared discomfort, a group of people, each privately concerned, yet publicly compliant. This is the perfect atmosphere for quiet control. No protest, no outrage, only adaptation. Dark psychology recognizes this, not as a coincidence, but as a mechanism. Power, when left unobserved, does not tend to reduce itself. It expands until something challenges it. And when normalcy bias is active, no challenge comes. People do not confront what they have normalized. They live inside it. By the time individuals begin to recognize that a line has been crossed, they must first confront their own inaction. That realization alone can be paralyzing. It creates shame. It raises questions about judgment, about responsibility, about how long they waited. And for many, that confrontation is more difficult than continuing to adjust. So they adapt again. They move the boundary again. They stay quiet again. Control becomes stronger, not because it grows more forceful, but because people grow more silent. In the beginning, your mind reacts to discomfort clearly. It signals when something feels off. It alerts you when a conversation shifts tone, when a gesture lacks sincerity, when the room carries a tension that cannot be explained. These signals are part of your survival system. They are not dramatic, they are not loud, but they are reliable. Yet over time, when these signals are repeatedly dismissed or downplayed, the mind starts to learn something new. It learns that responding is not rewarded, that discomfort is to be tolerated, that observation is not meant to lead to action. And with that lesson, something fundamental begins to change. Your sensitivity starts to fade. The sharpness of awareness softens. You begin to move through life with less response, less urgency, less resistance. You see more, but feel less. You continue your habits, maintain your conversations, fulfill your responsibilities. On the surface, nothing is broken, but inside, the connection between awareness and action is thinning. This process is not rare. In fact, it is one of the most common psychological conditions seen in long-term stress environments. Emotional numbing is not the absence of emotion. It is the consistent suppression of emotion in order to preserve function. It is your mind choosing silence over conflict, stillness over effort, and neutrality over truth. At first, this shift feels like resilience. You tell yourself you are stronger now, that you are no longer bothered by small things, that you have matured. But what you may be experiencing is not growth, it is detachment. And detachment, when it becomes your default state, slowly disconnects you from the ability to recognize when something is deeply wrong. Normalcy bias makes this easier. It encourages you to assume that the absence of chaos is proof of stability, that if the situation were truly dangerous, you would feel alarmed, that because everything looks normal, you must be safe. But what happens instead is a kind of psychological sleep. You continue functioning, but the core signals that once protected you are now buried under rationalization. In the therapy room, this presents as stillness that feels unnatural. People speak of things that should cause distress with flatness in their voice. They describe isolation, betrayal, and exhaustion, but frame them as everyday conditions. They talk about the weight they carry as if it belongs to someone else. And when asked when this started, they usually say they cannot remember. It did not begin all at once. It was gradual, invisible, and by the time they noticed it, it had already shaped the way they see everything. You are not born numb. You become numb by repeatedly choosing silence over truth, delay over decision, and appearance over reality. The mind may adapt to pain by turning off emotion, but that adaptation comes at the cost of your ability to live fully, feel deeply, and respond when it matters most. In a world that praises endurance, numbing is often mistaken for strength. People carry emotional exhaustion like a badge of honor. They show up, do their work, maintain their roles, and push through the weight without complaint. They are labeled dependable, disciplined, and calm, but behind that calm, there is often a mind that has disconnected from its own internal compass. This disconnection is not always easy to identify. It can feel like burnout. It can feel like apathy. It can feel like no longer caring about what used to matter. But beneath all those sensations is a deeper process, a learned dismissal of instinct, a quiet rewiring of response. When you stop acting on what you feel, your feelings stop guiding you. You may still recognize tension in a room, but you stop adjusting your behavior. You may sense that something is off in a relationship, but you stay silent. You may know that a decision is overdue, but you keep yourself busy with distractions. Over time, you begin to lose trust in your own reactions. You become uncertain about when to speak, when to act, when to walk away. Normalcy bias feeds this disorientation. It provides the perfect mental shortcut to avoid examining discomfort. It tells you that you are just tired, that it is just a phase, that everyone feels this way eventually. You begin to accept the absence of emotion as a form of balance, when in fact it is a sign that your system has stopped trying to warn you. In therapeutic practice, we see the consequences of long-term disconnection unfold in subtle but life-altering ways. People describe looking at their lives and realizing they do not recognize themselves. They speak about friendships that feel hollow, work that feels mechanical, and habits that no longer serve any purpose. Yet they continue, not because they believe in what they are doing, but because the alternative feels even more uncertain. They say they miss who they used to be. They remember being more present, more intuitive, more alive. But somewhere along the way, survival became more important than clarity. Stability became more important than growth. And that choice, made over and over again, eventually reshaped who they are. The tragedy is not that people feel this way. The tragedy is how long they carry it before they admit it to themselves. You can live for years on automatic. You can maintain careers, raise families, build reputations, and still feel empty at the center. That emptiness does not come from failure. It comes from the accumulation of ignored instincts, avoided conversations, and postponed truth. And once this pattern becomes familiar, it becomes defended. People stop wanting to feel too much. They avoid situations that might trigger discomfort. They tell themselves it is better this way, that emotional distance is safer, cleaner, easier to manage. But that distance also blocks joy. It blocks depth. It blocks the ability to truly connect. This is how people become functional, respected, and quietly broken at the same time. You can adapt to anything, even your own slow disappearance from yourself. There is nothing gentle about waking up from emotional and psychological numbness. It does not arrive like inspiration. It does not feel like relief. For many, it begins with discomfort, a growing sense that something is wrong, even if it cannot yet be explained, an internal restlessness that cuts through the silence you have grown used to. When awareness returns, it does not come with perfect clarity. It brings everything at once: regret, confusion, anger, grief, sometimes guilt. You begin to realize how long you have stayed quiet, how long you have tolerated what you should have confronted, how many things you explained away because you thought they would fix themselves. The mind starts to piece together what it ignored, and with that clarity, the weight of missed time becomes real. This is why many people resist change, not because they enjoy the lie, but because they fear the pain of facing it. It is easier to say everything is fine than to admit that the foundation has already cracked. It is easier to believe you are in control than to admit that you were pretending to be. And it is easier to stay numb than to re-enter a world where every decision begins to carry meaning again. Normalcy bias keeps you within that protective shell. It holds the pieces of your illusion together, even when they no longer match reality. And the moment you begin to question it, the illusion starts to fall apart. What was once invisible becomes undeniable. You see it in your habits, in your relationships, in your voice, in your body. You feel it everywhere you once felt nothing. The awakening is not soft. It is not polite. It does not wait for permission. But it is necessary, because staying numb is not safety. It is slow erosion. It may protect you from immediate pain, but it also blocks truth, love, integrity, connection, and purpose. And when all of that is gone, what remains is not peace. What remains is emptiness. You may not get back the time you lost, but you can choose to stop giving your silence to the parts of your life that no longer deserve it. You can choose to see what you were once trained to ignore. You can choose to respond to discomfort as information, not as a threat. The choice to wake up is not about being brave. It is about being honest. And honesty does not feel good at first. It feels raw. It feels heavy. It feels unfamiliar. But honesty reconnects you to your instincts. It restores your ability to trust what you see, to respond to what you feel, and to stop pretending when everything inside you already knows the truth. You do not need a collapse to justify change. You do not need permission to leave the patterns that no longer fit. And you do not need to stay calm in a life that has already started screaming for something different. You only need to stop pretending. That is where it begins. If this spoke to you, share it with someone who is still waiting for a sign. Let them know the sign is already inside them. And if you want to keep exploring the psychology that hides in silence, subscribe and stay with me. We are not done yet, not even close.